Okay, so again, thanks very much for the invitation. So I'm going to be talking about the impact of higher education research. I'll say something about who I am in just a moment. Let me just give you a little bit of background about the UK higher education environment. So in the UK, there's something like of the order of about over 100 universities. They're essentially all autonomous institutions, but although they're autonomous institutions, the government does have an influence through the funding of these universities on what actually universities get up to. There's a well-known literature on the term new public management, which is a term that evolved out of the 1980s, and one would associate that with various privatisations. But the way that's hit universities in the UK is essentially universities have been judged in terms of their research quality and their teaching quality over something like 25 years. So this is really just a feature of public accountability. So research assessment, I'm going to be talking mainly about research assessment. That's been very much a feature of the UK environment over the last 25 years. Every 5 or 6 years, there is something called a research assessment exercise in the UK, in which there are peer review grading of university departments. And I was in the last assessment exercise, which took place just last year in 2014. I was a member of one of the panels, one of the subject panels, peer reviewing essentially the research outputs of all my colleagues in other universities in my particular subject, my subject being financial economics. So an important, these research assessment exercises have been going on for 25 years. The rules typically change on every time. And an important change in the last assessment exercise was the inclusion of this term of impact. So research outputs were also assessed in terms of their impact. Now that raises the question, what do we mean by impact? Okay, so what do we mean by research impact? So research impact, there are some broad definitions and also very specific definitions associated with the particular research exercise. So broad definitions would be the impact of research is the effect or the impact that research has on people's lives. And we might think that research has a positive impact if it has a positive impact, a positive effect on people's lives, if it changes people's lives in a positive way. Right? So and one of the definitions there is that research impact has an effect, change or benefit to the economy, society, culture, public policy or services, health, the environment or quality of life. So that's what, in a very general terms, we mean by the impact of research. So in this research assessment that took place last year, there were slightly more refined rules concerning this impact. But essentially, research that had been taken place over the previous 6 years in UK universities were partly assessed in how that was changing people's lives, right? And that was the criteria that was being used to judge university research. Interestingly, we could draw a distinction between what we mean by public engagement and the impact of research. And I think a good distinction between what we mean between public engagement and the impact of research is that public engagement is something that is associated with an individual researcher, whereas the impact of research is the notion that the research itself has some identity, which then actually has some kind of impact. So it's somehow the notion that an author is distinct from the author's book. The book might have impact. The author might, for whatever celebrity reasons, have status themselves. So there's a kind of famous character in the UK who appears on the television all the time. So he's everybody's popular scientist, and that's this character here. So he's called Brian Cox, and he's always on the television in the UK explaining how the solar system works. Importantly, he's an academic. But whatever his research is, he's actually having a public engagement, which is separate from his research. He's just engaging as an academic and popularizing science, which is different from any underlying research that he's doing and the effect of that underlying research on society. Okay. So with respect to what do we mean by social science impact, and probably the easiest way of thinking of what we mean by that is to give some examples, right? And so rather helpfully, this REF process actually came up with some examples of what we mean by impact, right? So, and these are examples of social science impact. Okay, so things like the number of jobs that have been created, right? So the extent to which the academic research creates jobs. Possibly the research changes legislation, right? Changes legislation. You know, can we identify those changes, and then can we monitor those changes? Also, perhaps the research has enabled stakeholders to challenge conventional wisdom, right? So these are all examples of what we mean by social science impact. So an interesting question is where this obsession, in the UK it certainly is an obsession with research impact. Where did it come from? An interesting aspect of that is, so periodically in the UK, the regulators come up with various reports about how to run the UK education environment. Interestingly, a report in 2003, which was concerned with the future research and assessment exercises, made no reference whatsoever to impact. But another review of universities in 2003, concerned with business-university collaboration, started mentioning the idea that universities ought to be promoting knowledge transfer through the impact of their research. And it was very much that the Treasury, so the UK's central government Treasury, took up this theme of the idea that if the Treasury or if the government funds academic research, the Treasury wants to see some return on this impact. And we observe a number of documents written by the Treasury throughout 2003, 2006, emphasising that if the Treasury are going to give money to universities, they want to see the benefits in terms of changes in society. Of course, that's not to say that there's not been a debate about whether this means that research goes down one particular dimension. Possibly it means that blue skies research gets parked in a corner rather than being addressed centrally by universities. And of course there's an interesting sort of externality in the sense that one might think that public funding of research is really needed where there's some kind of market failure. If it's the case that research is indeed having some demonstrable impact on people's lives, then we might think that the private sector should be funding that kind of research. It's research that doesn't have impact that possibly should be being funded by universities. So there is that debate. But having said that, there is that debate. In some sense, the rules of the REF rode roughshod over that debate and went ahead with the research assessment exercise with respect to impact anyway. So, of course, in a way, it's not clear what's new about impact. In some sense, impact has always been part of just an academic's bread and butter life, in the sense that you might, when you have some kind of research idea, you might be interested in whether the research will have some effect. You might be talking to a PhD student, asking the PhD student whether they think their research is interesting, whether it's likely to have some effect on policy at some point. So research impact has always been embedded in research, in academic research. The difference is that what's happening in the last research assessment exercise in the UK is that impact is actually being measured. How's it being measured? It gets measured either by reach or significance, and I'll talk more about what those terms are in just a couple of slides. So how does one measure impact? Right? So, there's relatively well-known studies in economics looking at the effect of research and development activity, possibly at a company level, in terms of various output measures, possibly in terms of the number of patents. So, and that perhaps makes a lot of sense within the social science, within the science environment. But the research assessment exercise that that the UK were undertaking applies not just to a few science subjects, but applies to all subjects. So it applies to economics, law, history. It applies to archaeology. Right. So how do you measure the impact of archaeological research, right? That's an interesting question. So the ESRC, so that's a government funding body that's concerned with funding social science research, probably because they could anticipate that this impact agenda was indeed going to appear at some point in the future, started analysing the methods for measuring impact. And they proposed a number of methodologies, sometimes referred to as tracking forward or tracking back. So tracking forward involves looking at the research and trying to see what the impact the research has had. Or an alternative way is to track backwards, is to take the impact of a policy, to take a policy, and having identified a policy, track back to see where the academic inputs into that policy actually occurred. Right? So, of course, you could, in addition to this essentially descriptive or narrative statements, you could also include various output measures, such as, various numbers, such as patents. It's just that the problem with patents is that they're very subject specific, and we're trying to measure impact across a wide range of subjects. There's also various issues in some of these quantitative numbers to do with more soft, ambiguous spillover effects of impact. So, for example, if I'm a scientist and I carry out a piece of research which actually results in a new drug being produced, right? We can kind of track through that impact. But an important component there would be that I might, as a research academic, I might employ a research assistant to work alongside me. Now, because I've employed that research assistant, I'm going to embed knowledge into that research assistant, and that research assistant is subsequently going to develop as an academic. Right? And of course, that's part of the impact of the research. So how do you quantify this spillover effects into the labour market? Right? And then also, of course, it's not just the labour market, but there'll be spillover effects from my particular drug that I've invented into other drugs and other aspects of the research community. So there's going to be these very, very wide potential impacts of a single piece of research. So how does one measure that? So essentially the conclusion was that the way we measure this is that we can only measure this through narrative case studies, right? So we're going to leave it up to the academics concerned to essentially explain a story about how what the impact was of their research, and I'll say more about what was actually done in just a moment. I think I'm going to skip over this particular case just in the interest of time and move straight to what the rules for impact were in this particular research assessment exercise. So the rules were announced in 2010, which rather interestingly was halfway through the research period of assessment, because the research period of assessment took place over the period 2008 to 2013. So halfway through the period, essentially the regulator suddenly came up with these rules for measuring impact. The rules decided to adopt this case study approach. And again, to emphasize, one of the reasons I think for the case study approach was to ensure homogeneity and consistency across all academic subjects, right? So to ensure an equal treatment across academic subjects. So the rules were that each university department, for every 10 people employed, every 10 members of staff, universities had to submit one case study. What did the case study look like? The case study had to describe some underpinning research. So this could be a research article that had been published ever since 1994. And then and then there's various criteria about qualifying that piece of research. And then they had to, the university or the individual academic had to explain in a narrative how that research had had an impact on the wider society. You could use quantitative numbers. It was up to the case to use quantitative numbers if it wanted, but it had to back any statements up with references and evidence. Right? So there was the notion of evidence that was needed to be provided. So again, here's a quote from the rules: "Case studies should provide a clear and coherent narrative linking the research to the proposed impact." Okay. The notion was there was a piece of research that was produced in the past, and therefore it was tracking forward what had happened to that piece of research, not back, right? Okay. Because it was starting with the piece of research. The tracking back is when you've got some impact measure that you can then track back and see how the research fed into it. But partly because the regulator wanted to measure the quality of the research outputs, it was trying to measure the quality of the research outputs in terms of the impact, the societal impact. Of course, therefore, what the universities had to do, and individual academics who were writing these cases, is they had to tell a story. Right? So they just had to tell a story. So the way you tell a story is there's a well-known narrative arc, right? In which you start with a beginning, a middle, you introduce tension. You introduce tension into the story to engage the reader, to try and ensure and to explain how your research has had this impact. Of course, you've got to be very careful that, these things are going to be public documents eventually, so that's going to act as a brake on making too many outlandish statements. And also importantly, you have to provide evidence. You have to provide evidence, testimonials about how this research has had this impact. So each case was assessed by a panel of 3 people. So the 3 people would be 2 academics and 1 user. So a user would typically be somebody from somebody outside the university system who was a user of this research. And each case was measured in terms of reach and significance. So reach is literally numbers of people. How wide was this research? And then the significance is, in some sense, what was the importance of this impact? Right? What was the importance? And there was a grading system, 4-star down to 1. With the obvious meaning that 4-star was outstanding impact, all the way down to no impact at all, being graded as 0. Okay. In actual fact, prior to the assessment exercise, the regulator, the Higher Education Funding Council for Education in England, ran a number of pilot studies. And so they did these pilot studies in a number of subjects. In the social sciences, they did it in social policy. So they actually they got in social policy, they got 11 departments to produce 38 cases, which were then assessed. They were made publicly available, so the rest of the social science community could then see what these cases looked like when they came to write their cases. In general, there were 2 problems identified with these cases. One of the things was that it turned out that nobody really understood what impact was. Right? So, although of course there are these thousands of very clever academics in the UK, actually explaining to people what impact is was actually a major problem with the exercise. And then a second problem was in actual fact just getting the data, getting the evidence of the impact. Having said that, the feedback was widely endorsed. It turns out that perhaps academics love talking about themselves, but academics who are writing these cases love filling in these cases, right? Explaining how their research has had an impact on the wider community is something that the academics who do these cases actually really enjoy. Right? So again, it's one of these slightly bizarre things about monitoring is you get monitored, but the people who are being monitored actually enjoy being monitored. Right? So just to give you a flavour. So why would it not be moving on? Okay. Again, okay, I think this is a slide I'll move over in the preparation of time. Oh, no, there's one point I want to make. I think a lovely side issue from this is how these cases were actually constructed by universities. And of course, as academics, most of the time, the research that we undertake is essentially individual. Right? One of the features of these case studies, partly because of the relatively limited number coming out of any university, it turns out that the central university administration were heavily involved in, not necessarily in writing the initial case study, but they would certainly be involved in improving the quality of the case. So it was, one of the features that came out of this is that central universities administration, so essentially the president of the university, would end up knowing quite a lot about the research that was actually being undertaken in their university through these case studies. So, I mean, that's, I think, is a very interesting feature of universities in the UK going forward, because it turns out that the university presidents probably do have quite a good idea, based on these case studies, of what their academics are actually doing. There is a typical kind of result chart. Right, this is just in alphabetical order, but the way these cases would be graded then would be, so here we've got, let's pick on the London School of Economics. So the London School of Economics in this case here had 51 academics being submitted. They submitted 5 case studies, and 70% of those case studies were graded as being 4-star, 30% was graded being 2-star. Right. So they were assessed and then they were graded. And this was done, so that was just from the pilot, but then in actual fact in the real ref in 2014, there are now 6,679 impact case studies across 35 disciplines actually publicly available for view on this website here. Right? So these are all publicly available. An interesting aspect of this research agenda the impact agenda going forward is, of course, now academics in the UK can start planning for impact, thinking about the impact that their research might have. So in 2014, these academics were essentially playing catch-up, because they were told halfway through the process that they were going to have this research was going to be monitored in terms of impact. Going forward, academics can, in principle, start planning their research to try and maximise impact. Of course, that's as with all monitoring, there are potential, good consequences and there are potential perverse consequences. I mean, some of the potential perverse consequences, of course, is that one of the great things about academic research is that it's typically peer-reviewed. Right? It's peer-reviewed. Of course, impact is not peer-reviewed. So there's, of course, there is always the potential for academics deliberately falsifying their results. But in a way, since impact is not peer-reviewed, perhaps there's more of an incentive to exaggerate your claims of impact. So I think there's certainly a risk management issue for universities going forward. Of course, there is a culture of research ethics, but you're pushing those ethics further and further. It becomes more difficult to maintain them when you've possibly got incentives to try and exaggerate the impact of your claim impacts. Of course, there's some trivial, possibly titles of papers will change to try and make them more dramatic. And perhaps some are not so perverse. There might be an effect on academic salaries. Those people constructing very good impact cases perhaps may expect at some point in the future to be rewarded through higher salaries. Notice it's not just the UK. I mean, in some way, the obsession with impact and perhaps relevance is something that's a global phenomenon. So, for example, the Academy of Management conference in 2013 had a session on impact. There's this relatively well-known book on free economics by Levitt and Dubner, and of course critics to that book ask questions about, well, whether this is just popular social science observations rather than being anything that's fundamentally about academic subjects, right? It's certainly popular, but is it research? Is it academic? And there's a lovely rebuttal of almost the role of relevance in economics by the president of the Econometric Society, Ariel Rubinstein, in 2006. And so there's a great quote from him making the point, essentially, that he just gets a lot of satisfaction out of explaining complicated arguments to students and watching a student's face when you finally explained something to them and they understand that argument you've presented. Of course, that's very much a form of impact, but that's not a form of impact that's being measured in this research assessment exercise. And so, in conclusion, what I'd like to think I've talked about today is explain and talk a little bit about what we mean by the definitions of impact, certainly in the context of this research assessment exercise from the UK. Talked about measurement in terms of these case studies. Notice that the feedback of this research assessment exercise was very positive, and the prediction is that feedback is certainly, this impact is going to be a feature of the UK higher education environment in the years ahead. And just to note that, as with all monitoring, the monitors will respond with the incentives provided, and not always in the ways that the monitors actually necessarily want. Okay, thank you very much.
Então, debate importante se anuncia, né, Márcio, com a nossa avaliação histórica aí do sistema dos quase 3.000 programas de pós-graduação avaliados pelos pares através da nossa CAPES. Então, obrigado ao professor Tonks. Então, vamos ao Marcelo, professor Marcelo, para sua apresentação.
So, good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to participate in this seminar. I would like to thank Rubens for the invitation. It's a pleasure to always talk about education, but I think it's even more so when we are studying our field of activities, which is higher education. So my presentation will be on higher education returns. The key questions I'll try to address is what are the private and social returns of higher education in Brazil. Of course, it's just a superficial picture. It's not just to give you the big numbers. The point I would like to discuss here, it's also related to what we are doing now, is about internationalization, as Professor Dourado mentioned. So how these returns can be affected by immigration policies, higher education related immigration policies, and to try to see these two questions from the perspectives of students and firms, so the demand side, and what are the impacts in terms of public policies. So I'll try to answer, giving very briefly a big picture of education evolution in Brazil, and then I try to access the returns of education, the premiums of higher education. First, comparing higher education with other levels of education, then going into different education careers like medicine, engineering, economics, etc. Then I talk a little bit on immigration policies, and if I have time, I discuss a few specific cases like engineering, doctors, management. We have a few programs in Brazil which is related with this internationalization of higher education, the Plus Doctors, Science Without Borders. I will not talk anything about access policies, since we're going to have a presentation by Professor Cecilia Machado on that, and not on evaluation systems of higher education, because we also have the last panel will be on that. And I'm not going to talk about the impact of research, okay? So that's the division of labor. So, of course, private return is a big part of the social return. Of course, if you're concerned about policies, this part which is social but it's not private is key. And by this I mean impact on social welfare, including not only growth but the distribution aspect, but also externalities that come from different higher education activities. Just to give one slide on Brazil social performance and the role of education. These are the income distribution changes from the first vintile to the top vintile. So it's the real per capita changes in the last 12 years. So the poor did better than the top of the distribution. The bottom 40 grew 96% in real per capita terms. Most of it is labor income, and behind labor income is what you may call education bonus. We're going to be discussing demographic bonus, but it's a very strong education bonus behind both the growth and the distribution aspect of these big income distribution change that happened in Brazil. So 96% was income growth. Out of that, 44 percentage points was education bonus. So it's the single most important driver of this change in the bottom of income distribution. So what's the ability of each real or pounds, if you want, to reach a student according to different levels of education? So basically, the top is illiteracy programs, which each real you spend in the program, either public or private, more than 1 real, 1.7 reais reach the poor, so less resources reach directly the not poor. Okay? So as we go along, we see that tertiary education, each real I spend, just 7 cents reach the poor. Okay? And when it's public, 12 cents reach the poor. So it's not particularly well targeted. It perhaps should not be well targeted. That's not perhaps the point, although. And each real I spend in graduate programs, 0 cents reach the poor. Okay, so as you move from public to private, less reach the poor for obvious reasons. But and when you go up in the education scale, less reais reach the poor. So just to assess the direct impact, just to have an idea. Okay. Second question, how much, of course, returns question, how much it costs. That's important, not to see who gets, but how much you have to give to the people. So, for example, private higher education costs in Brazil, per Brazilian, not per student, but per Brazilians as a whole, costs more privately than all other education expenses, all other levels. So it's to be something like 10 reais per Brazilian per month, okay? So it's important. So let me look at the premiums, education premiums. So Brazil, we have very high returns to education. And these returns, and there are increasing returns. If I move from 0 to 4 years of education, the wage rises 8 percentage point, 8% every year. When I move from 11 to 15 years of education, it used to move 21% per year. Okay, on average, it used to be 15%. Okay, the premium of education. Each year of education increases wages by 15%, which is quite high for international comparisons. Yeah, that's a control, by other characteristics. There's also an employment effect there. So education is, of course, very good in private terms. It used to be better than it is now. That's a question. But this has been falling very fast in Brazil. That's behind the income distribution change. So basically, the differential between higher education, including completed and incompleted, okay, with respect to illiterate persons, has fell continuously, and so it's 30% fell in 10 years or 11 years. So it's a big fall of returns, which is a good thing. Of course, not so good for us, which have but for society as a whole, this is a key. Before, if you have a degree, you would be like a king, like Professor Lindolfo mentioned. You just very few persons used to have a degree, so you extract a very high return from that, very high premium from that. So this is falling. This is a big change, and I think this imposes some challenges for higher education in Brazil. This was up to beginning of 2015, and now last data available shows the same trend is going on. Growth has stagnated in Brazil, but still illiterate persons and people with very low education are getting higher growth than people with a lot of education, with more education. And this still continues up to now, 2015. The difference that income is not growing anymore. Okay, thank you. That income is not growing anymore, okay? But the differentials are falling. Why is this happening? First, if I see not only higher education, but other productive attributes, like, for example, technical course, or I have a protected, a formal job, or I work in a big firm, all these things are increasing in Brazil. These things are associated with higher earnings. So people are getting better productive attributes in Brazil as everywhere, of course, as society progresses. But the different point in Brazil is the fact that the mean is on the top part, is the fact that those people with these better attributes are getting much lower earnings gains. So it's a combination of better attributes, but the fact that people with no productive or bad or worse productive attributes are the ones who are getting the big rises. So this is a very odd combination that's happening in Brazil and Latin America. That's what is behind these income distribution changes or the returns of education fall. So let me move fast. So what's behind that? There is a rise in the access of higher education in Brazil. It's increasingly steep. But it's still very, very low levels compared to any international program. So, I mean, although we do have very high returns of higher education in Brazil, it doesn't explain, it used not to explain much of Brazilian inequality. Why? Because there are so few people with higher education that doesn't affect much the distribution, although they have a very high differential, okay? So this is the, postgraduate is also steep, but look, graduate completed levels is 0.4, so it reminds me of the 50s picture that Professor Lindolfo, so it's very rare. A very rare thing. So I talk about 0.4% of the whole population have a graduate degree completed. So what's the map of higher education in Brazil? The colors are not very well chosen, but it's really very, very almost white, very, very clear. You see that dark spot in the middle of Brazil, that's Brasilia, where the central government is. Maybe explain something. So if I look at the map, pick up the municipalities where there is a bigger share of people with university degrees. São Caetano in São Paulo, and there are another 4 suspicious cities. They always get the better indicators. Niterói, Vitória, Florianópolis, Santos, very high income, lots of high education, educated students, access to computers, higher income, biggest share of doctors. So all the indicators, these are the leaders among the 5,500 municipalities in Brazil. And look at the difference between the worst municipality. So it's not like it's 1 to 100, the difference of access to these Canópolis in Bahia, it's 0.24, while in Niterói, just around here, across the bay, it's 29%. So it's really very, very different. So going to the second part, looking at the details of higher education. So this is a ranking of labor market outcomes according to university careers using the census data. So the top is medicine in Brazil, as in other places, is much higher than any other profession. Dentistry, civil engineering. I will focus some attention on medicine and civil engineering here. So this is a ranking that combines wages, working hours, occupation rates, social security coverage using these 4 indicators, giving more weight to wages. If I do a multivariate exercise in order to control for observables, the ranking becomes like this, not much change. Still doctors are on the top. I'm holding some characteristics constant, so you can visualize the results better. So a doctor with certain characteristics, live in São Paulo, middle age, etc., has 8,000, used to have 8,500 reais per month, while the second position, like in the defense sector, probably is 1,000 reais less, so this is the ranking. One point that's going to be discussed here in the first afternoon session is about rankings. So I would like to pay 2 minutes to that. So the lowest, so this is the top ones, the bottom ones are these ones. So religion related is the lowest in labor market outcomes. So it's, okay. So we devise here a simulator using multivariate models, so you can go there and see if I change from economics to engineering, how much my wages on average rise, how much my occupation rises, etc. So I'm an economist. I'm thinking seriously after this exercise of changing area, okay? So I put economics and let's say, so let's raise my self-esteem. So let's compare with religion, okay? With not arts, religion. So this is the, so if I move to religion, would have half my wages, would work less on the other hand, would have a slightly lower occupation rate, would be 10 percentage points less covered. So here you have the estimated model. But if, on the other hand, I move from economics to, where is medicine? Yeah. Then I would double my wage, given the same characteristics. I would not change much the graph, my occupation rate, my working hours. Occupation rate would rise a little bit. This is on the right, and the formality would rise a little bit. So this is just to give a flavor of the, So just one slide for Jan, just to, to start some conversation here. So I believe very much in this rank, this popularity, especially in Brazil, where a big part of the population has very low level of education. I think you really have to talk, simplify things, not simplify the reasons behind, but the way you mentioned. So I believe FGV has this role of, for example, this U index at the university careers. I think it helps decisions, So this is part of the scheme, but we can discuss that. So second part about immigration, higher education related immigration. So first point, the most important point, Brazil is a very, very close country. We don't think ourselves as like this, but we only have 0.3% of first generation immigrants in the country. The world average is 3%, US is 15%. So we are 1/50 of the US and 1/10 of the world. Latin America as a whole is very close. So we are very close societies. And if I consider the fact that 1/3 of our immigrants are 65 years of age or older, it's 0.2. In 1900, used to be 7.3. So we became a very close country. We are one of the closest countries you can get in the world. This also impacts our students' going abroad. We are on the very, very bottom of the income distribution, although we have big efforts, etc., but very few students. Like, for example, in Australia, 13 out of each 1,000 residents go study abroad. In Brazil, 0.2. So we are talking not about 40% difference, but 400 or even more than that. So we are very close. And but if you ask Brazilians, would you accept people? So this is an opinion poll we did at SAI, asking people, are you in favor, direct to the whole population? People are very much in favor of high professional education people, higher education people coming to the country, especially if it's a doctor. Okay, so there is more than 3/4 of the population give a big support to that. So this is something I learned. I didn't expect that. So we are actually very open in our ideas, our aspirations, but not in practice. We have to change legislation or do something different. And actually, if you look at different data that comes from this research, 3/4, 73.7, are favorable of coming of high education people. 2/3 believe it will be good for the country as a whole. 70%, 71 believe will increase our productivity. So people are very much in line with this idea. So it's not, of course, trade unions don't like very much the idea for obvious reasons. But Brazilians as a whole do like the idea. Even, 84% of Brazilians would be receptive to moving a foreigner with high education to your own firm. So it's really, people are really open to that. So final part, try to mix the specific careers and immigration issues, okay? So we did a few years ago a research on lack of doctors, okay? This was mid-2000s. So just to touch a point where Cecilia will also touch this point. Brazil is not very bad in terms of access to doctors worldwide, okay? We are more or less in the middle. With World Health Organization, we are not very far. But if you look at the distribution, it's really, so it's a distribution part. It's more than the mean, it's where the doctors are. If I go within the same state of Rio, we see some municipalities, the metro regions, have very low level, no doctors at all. Actually, if you see the city of Rio, there is this municipality, which is Niterói, I mentioned that, has more doctors per habitants than the country of the world that has more doctors per habitants, which is Cuba. Niterói has a lot of doctors there, okay? Fortunately, 40% of these doctors, they don't work in Niterói, they move and they go back, I mean, when the traffic allows, but this is, and in the same city of Rio, this big Rio, the great Rio, there is Belfort Roxo, which is the worst indicator of all big municipalities. The same thing with Vitória. Vitória is the second in the ranking, and Serra, which is in the same metro region, is the second worst in the ranking. So there is this distribution aspect. And we have this program, plus doctors that try to facilitate immigration. It's very controversial, etc. We don't know how exactly it works, but it really reaches, because most of the doctors that came are from Cuba, so this creates some sort of a debate on that. But this is, so I think Brazil is open, and we did already a big program, which is the Plus Doctors. So we have an experience where we can learn about. But in Brazil, unfortunately, we are not very likely to do evaluations, serious evaluations of these programs, which is so. Second point, engineers. Also very, but doctors, I mean, doctors have to be where the population is. Engineers, maybe not, but doctors for sure. You cannot have people without doctors. Engineers, you have to have factories, you have to have other, but still, big concentration on the south. If I see some research from Maloney, in the beginning of 19th century, you see he explains quite well the growth with the number of engineers, the density of engineers. It's very important drive. It's not only higher education, but engineers play a very important role. Also, make a long story short, if people come from abroad, this is very important for entrepreneurship in the country. Migrants are more entrepreneurial. They do not only bring new ideas, but they bring business, because migration is a business in itself, like moving from one country to the other. So this is what this data shows. Brazil, in Latin America as a whole, we have very bad, go to another field, management skills when you evaluate them. But when you ask people what you think about your management skills, people think they are very good. So there is a gap. So why? Because firms don't know what they don't know. If you're very close, you think you're doing just fine. But when you open, you realize that you have so much to do. So in management, which is Jan's area, we have this problem. Final point, technical tertiary education. So I'm talking about short courses at university degree level. They are very rare in Brazil. There's 150,000 students of these technology courses, very few. But there's big increase. People are not talking about this increase that happened since 2004 in technical education of all level. And share with higher education, this share is on top of that, is increasing. So there is a big increase from a very low basis. So if you basically look at education in Brazil and higher education in general, you have two things. The picture is still very, very bad. But there is quite a lot of movements in this picture. So it's still a bad picture, but a good movie in the sense there's a good movement between what happened in the last 2-3 decades in Brazil, as was said before. So just to organize in this issue of higher education technical courses, we do have some good data, so it allows us to answer much more questions. So what's the return, the premium from different courses? So technological courses give you a premium of 21% for the course as a whole, not per year, for the course as a whole, which is 1 year of used to be of university degree, undergraduate. First year of graduate studies gives you, like, used to give 40%. I say used because the data is from 2007, so these things are changing. 42% increase, so twice faster than the undergrad degree, not talking about which area. The problem in Brazil, given our deficiencies, as Professor Dourado mentioned, of earlier regular education, sometimes the higher education has to spend a lot of time to do catching up on the earlier courses. So this is a key problem we do have. If you analyze the returns of education, what is better? Privates, just look at face value. Public, not looking to the detail. Non-profit, in terms of technical education. The best is private, then public and non-profit are similar. The best one actually is S-system, which is a particular system we have in Brazil, but I'm not saying I'm not talking about cost benefit, I'm talking about the benefit itself. It's very costly. So we didn't find any difference between daytime and evening courses or between online and classroom courses, no significant difference, which is, for me, was quite surprising. We do find some diploma effect. When you finish a course, you get a higher jump than if you don't. So you have a benefit from the last mile, the last finish a course. But unfortunately, as I say, we do very little evaluation. That's something in Brazil, that's perhaps what explains where we are. And we are doing lots of programs, really lots of programs, but we don't know really which one work, which one don't work. So just to finish with the demand question, okay? So I believe, I'm an economist, I shouldn't say that, but I believe very much in, because economists, normally we are very much like scientists in the, like a physics. You know, we have our model of rationality, we go to the data, we reject or don't reject the data, that's how we work. But I think it's very interesting when you go to people and ask them, you know, why, you know, not my model, but, so I think it's complementary in a sense. So the survey did this question, did you attend technical education, yes or no? No, why not? Did you conclude? Talk about yes or no, why not? Did you, if you conclude, did you work in the area of the course? Yes or no, why not? So these is the questions and these are the answers. So at higher education range, 62%, the majority, didn't attend any course. When you ask people why, they say it's lack of demand, it's not lack of supply. We tend to think of these policies as supply side. Or I have a good technical course, that's it. Of course, we have to talk with the students if they agree with us. In the case of technical education, it's even harder because you have to convince the students that the course is good and afterwards convince firms that the course is good, so they should hire these former students. So the big message is demand. It's not lack of resources which you could set a scholarship. It's lack of interest. People are not really interested. And the same thing applies to secondary education in Brazil. If you ask people, students from 15 to 17 years of age, why are you not in school? There is no school, you have no resources, why? Just not interested. So this is the main, no demand for that. So I think this is much harder than a supply side thing. Supply, you have to supply good education. The demand, you have to supply good education. On top of that, you have to convince people that's worth going. That's why I think the returns is important to focus on the returns and to make it simple and people understand how much difference education will make in their lives. People who attended, most concluded the courses. When you say just 5% didn't conclude, also the main answer behind that, 2/3 is a lack of demand, what's behind. And why lack of demand? Dissatisfaction, didn't like the course, but just a minority that don't conclude the course. If I ask people that conclude, did you work in the area of the course? 80% say I work in the area of the course if it's higher education. There is what we learned, there is a 10% law. If I go from higher education, it's 80%. If I go to technical education that's equivalent to secondary, it goes down to 70. If I go to even lower course, it goes down to 60. And when you ask people that didn't work in the area, why not? People who didn't work with higher education say, oh, I found a better job, I found a work, so it was a good thing in the end. So what the data suggests is that demand is key. It's not only a matter of devising good courses, but you have to attract people, and especially students, as Professor Rubens mentioned. We have the biggest share of youth in our whole history, previous, going backward, and going forward. We will never have such a huge share of youth. 51 million Brazilians are between 15 and 29 years of age. And frankly, they don't know exactly what they want. Their parents know even less so. And the government, it's completely out. So we really have to tackle this demand part. That's, I think, is the main lesson. So this is the data I've shown. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Então, realmente, professor, o senhor é difícil, né? Foi uma apresentação de 25 minutos e a outra de quase 30 minutos. Não foi muito, foi mais ou menos parecida, né? Dois temas muito interessantes, uso do recurso público e seu impacto sobre o bem-estar da população, medido através da pesquisa ou através de políticas públicas, e o professor Marcelo traz elementos fundamentais para nós discutirmos a imensa desigualdade brasileira, que se nós avançamos muito, mas nós temos muito ainda, um longo caminho a percorrer. E o nosso professor da Universidade de Bastos traz o grande desafio, Márcio, que é como avaliar o impacto da pesquisa realizada pelo mundo acadêmico. Posso perguntar ao senhor, há 3 perguntas? Pode ser? 3 perguntas e breves respostas por conta do tempo. 3 perguntas. 1, 2. E o senhor a terceira. Ok. Pronto.
Bom dia a todos. Alstenberg, ex-aluno da EPGE. Marcelo e a mesa. São algumas contradições. Primeiro, o Brasil tem um número enorme de estudantes fora do Brasil, no Brasil sem fronteiras, que quando retornam não encontram trabalho. Por outro lado, temos um cenário que tem que ser decidido. Vamos investir no ensino médio, vamos investir na educação básica, vamos investir em todos e, além de formar pessoas capacitadas para tornar o Brasil competitivo, né? Nós não somos competitivos, a indústria, enfim. Então, o Marcelo que esteve no governo, qual seria a diretriz, Marcelo? Ou fazemos um pouquinho de cada coisa, ou tomamos um rumo e depois postergamos o outro? Muito obrigado.
Oi, meu nome é Paula, sou aluna de graduação da UFRJ de Economia. E eu queria perguntar para o Marcelo também se essa falta de demanda, se é, então, uma coisa cultural. E, se for, como você pode mudar essa cultura? Já que a gente tem que chamar os cientistas sociais e tudo. Além disso, eu queria saber como foi feita essa pesquisa, essa última que ele apresentou, mostrando o desinteresse e tudo. Se considerou diferentes classes sociais, que cada um respondeu, e se teve diferenças entre essas classes. E queria saber se os dois podem disponibilizar as apresentações. Só isso.
Ok.
I'd like to congratulate the panelists, and not out of protocol only. They have been very interesting presentations. Since I had a question for each one, but since 2 questions have already been addressed to Marcelo, I'd like to make a short question to Professor Ian Tonks and a provocation. The short question is, I'm a bit concerned about the bias against those who work in the inner pillars of the building of science. I mean, those who prove the theorems, those who do not have a contribution in very applied science. And just to have an idea, we are exactly now here in this institution facing the same type of question, but not regarding exactly the social impact of research, but the social impact of innovation. So it's the question of the possible bias that those who are not very connected to the public could suffer. And the provocation, let me ask you, what's the name of this guy who is in the Bridge TV saying things about the solar system? Is it Wonders? Coates. Brian Coates, okay. I'm going to take this symmetric, the anti-symmetric of that. If you think about Nicolaus Copernicus, Johannes Kepler, Tycho Brahe, and Isaac Newton, take their research, ask anybody in the UK, okay, that time it was already UK, or ask somebody in Germany if the research that these guys were doing would somehow affect their lives in feeling very cold and hungry. They'd say, not at all. So the question is, that guy at the TV, he has public influence, has no research. These guys had research. But the timing, that's the question. the timing that you measure these things, that's of utmost importance. If you allow yourself to have a 200-year horizon, then it's going to be terrific. And so my concern is that we sometimes are too much myopic and do not put the money in these long-run research.
Yes, good question. And you're completely right, of course. Yes, there is a bias against fundamental, difficult research. I think, to be fair to the originators of the scheme, that's why it's a department. The research assessment measures the impact of an institution, of a department, not of an individual. So, although I still understand that your question still applies in a way, because you're then saying, to rephrase your question, does this mean that departments of whatever subject cannot go down the route of pure theory? And you're completely right. That would be an implication of this, that departments in whatever subject we're talking about are required to have a portfolio approach to both impactful research as well as, if you like, underlying fundamental research. And yes, that is an implication of this, that departments are being forced down that route, but not individuals, because then it's up to the department to take a portfolio approach to the type of research that they're producing. And you're completely right, of course, about the long-term nature. And but again, that's just a question about the monitoring, and people are trying to monitor these activities over a short period of time. I mean, again, the rules of this exercise were that the underlying research could go back, in actual fact, 15 years. So there was a longer time period there. But I mean, I still take your point that there is a time dimension to that.
Okay.
Okay, very, very briefly. So the first question, Mr. Assenberg, about the students who are not getting jobs coming from Science Without Borders. First, as we just saw in a seminar organized by FGV, Professor Carlos Nobre from CAPES mentioned that we are not really evaluating the Science Without Borders. That's the basic thing. We have to see what are the returns. That's something you do very well. I mean, you're at least trying to do very well in the United Kingdom, and that's something we don't do in Brazil. We do a lot of monitoring, because Brazil has a big government, and the government doesn't like to assess itself and has this power not to do so. Okay? Like if you go to Central America, a lot of the public policies are outsourced. So the government, hire, institutions to do the policies, and then it's natural to hire other institutions to do the evaluations, part of the process. Here, so we have to move out of this trap, because we are really doing a lot of stuff, but we don't know which are the good stuff and which are not the good programs. I think, Brazil is in a big change now. The rate of unemployment, if these guys didn't get a job, they won't get a job in the next year or so. It will be much harder. The unemployment rate in 6 months went back in 6 years. In just 6 months, 1 month, 1 year per month. That's what's going on. But Brazil was in full employment you may call in December last year. So maybe it's not that bad. And maybe the program is not that good, in the sense if people in that situation are not getting jobs, something wrong with the program, probably. Of course, you have to look at the details. With the main question from Ana Paula, I think there are two possibilities. There is a paradox. If education, higher education, has this high return in Brazil, private return, I'm not talking about social return, but private return, social would be on top of that, Why people are not interested? One possibility is lack of knowledge. That's why I think it's very important to communicate, to interact, to show, well, of course, this is not the only reason why you want to be a doctor. That's not even the most important reason. It's because you're going to get well paid. But people should know that. And sometimes people don't know that. So it's lack of knowledge. The second, which is worrying, it maybe is the quality of supply. Maybe people don't want something that they don't see the process, the supply of education is not of a good quality. So I think in a sense we have to look at the demand side, and we are going now through a very difficult adjustment period. And I think we lost timing completely of immigration policies. Brazil, if we launched a huge immigration policies 1 year ago, would be a big success, or in the last 5 years. Why? Because the labor market was tight. We had a very good exchange rate, was very good to work in Brazil. Now it's good to come and spend your money here. You're rich, About 1 year ago, you would be poor in Brazil, so it would be a good time to attract talents. And we lost the timing of that, and the labor market has changed completely. So something we had to do, we had very good conditions to do, we didn't do, and the things we do at the right timing, we lost the timing. And the second thing is that we didn't evaluate. So I think we are in a period where we have to do evaluation, because we do really spend a lot of money, and it's time to rebalance the budget. So we're going to have to see what's worth. So that's the time where evaluation is in the right timing. Obrigado.
Então nós agradecemos aos nossos palestrantes e vamos tomar um café, e novas questões surgem, novas pistas para pesquisa surgem das intervenções aqui realizadas. Muito obrigado e até o breve.